While cinema audiences can't get enough of cops and robbers, heists and hostages, in West Germany in August 1988, a real-life heist and hostages drama played out on live television in a media circus that became known as the Gladbeck hostage crisis. The saga combined violence with farce and incompetence, and shone a light on the early stages of a terminal decline in the standards and ethics of modern journalism. At 7:55 a.m. on the 16th of August that year, two career criminals, Hans-Jürgen Rösner and Dieter Degowski, broke into a Deutsche Bank in the Renfurt Nord district of Gladbeck, a large town in the northwest of what was then West Germany. Employees were forced at gunpoint to hand over 120,000 Deutschmarks, or around 65,000 US dollars. A witness made an emergency call to police at around 8:04 a.m. When the robbers emerged from the bank, they noticed a parked police car, so immediately returned to the bank and took two tellers hostage, demanding a car and ransom money and firing their weapons into the air several times. As word got around, the media circus started, going against what would have been widely considered journalistic ethics at the time. An RTL radio station journalist, Hans Meiser, called the bank to interview the two robbers. The bank branch director, Wolfgang Schöning, was the conduit through which getaway negotiations took place, and by 9:45 a.m., the robbers had secured a white Audi 100 and a further 300,000 Deutschmarks, delivered by an unarmed policeman, stripped down to his underwear. The police had ensured that the Audi was wired for sound and tracking, and assumed that within the next few hours, the abductors would have both released their captives and be in police custody. As a result, the police made no real plan for hostage rescue, and didn't put any heat on the perpetrators right from the moment of the getaway. Bizarrely, this resulted in the abductors and their captives driving around Gladbeck for the next few hours, shopping for food and alcohol as though on a day out. Rösner had suspected the car would be bugged, so he was also on the lookout for another car. When attempts to get one failed, he even had the temerity to stick up a policeman at a local petrol station, stealing his sidearm and radio. The group eventually stole two other cars, before abandoning them in the fear that they were police decoys. A third vehicle they stole did in fact turn out to have been planted by the police. Prior to finally leaving Gladbeck, they picked up Rösner's girlfriend, Marianne Löblich, a fact not initially noted by police. That evening, they drove to Osnabrück before doubling back and heading for Dortmund, then finally ended up in the city of Hagen. All the while they stopped in rest areas and at roadside services, in full view of the public, apparently unconcerned about being apprehended. By the early hours of the 17th of August, the group headed north to Bremen, arriving in the district of Vegesack, where Rösner and Löblich left the car to visit Löblich's family, leaving Degowski in charge of the hostages. The police in Bremen had been notified of their presence and were keeping a loose watch on the car. At one point, Degowski left the car for several minutes to urinate, yet neither hostages nor police made a move. Eventually, the group came back together and moved around Bremen. The regional police attempted to follow, but managed to lose them. This was made all the more ridiculous when reporters started appearing in the media, detailing the group's location in and around Bremen, even including news crew footage of them at various stops while they considered their next move. Police appealed to the media not to cover the events, using the safety of the hostages as justification. However, it seemed more likely that they were trying to hide their own shortcomings. Rösner made repeated calls to the police to reopen negotiations, but the police refused to speak to him or any other proxies. After forcing one of the hostages to call in, and then hearing that their efforts to renegotiate were again being rebuffed, the robbers fled the scene in Hückelriede, southeast of central Bremen, and hijacked a local bus with 32 passengers on board. The bus was stopped at a red light, allowing police to reach the scene, resulting in a standoff developing. However, there were nowhere near enough police to seal off the area, which allowed the media to swoop in as well. Another bizarre scene eventuated. News reporters were able to get around and even in the bus to interview both abductors and hostages without any interference from the police. The police did, however, sneak some plainclothes officers onto the bus, though they were under strict orders not to intervene in the situation. Police marksmen were also placed in surrounding buildings. 5 elderly hostages were released on the initiative of the hostage takers, since the police did not provide a negotiator, and demands were communicated to the authorities via a press photographer at the scene, Peter Mayer. The hijackers wanted another car, as well as the swapping of the hostages for a police officer. They weren't shy about reiterating this in more interviews outside the bus, accompanied by threats to kill the hostages if these conditions were not met. Later in the evening, Rusner put a gun to the head of a 9-year-old girl and used her as a human shield when he believed he was being targeted by a sniper. Finally, the bus left Bremen, followed by police and a ragtag convoy of private cars and taxis containing journalists, one of which was fired on by Rusner, who mistook it for an unmarked police car. After a number of stops, the bus eventually pulled into a service area near the town of Sutrum, where the 2 bank clerks were finally released, and Degowski conducted a TV interview whilst holding a hostage at gunpoint. When Rusner's girlfriend Lublich went to the bathroom, she was arrested by 2 Bremen police officers on their own initiative, prompting an ultimatum from Rusner, stating that they would kill a hostage every 5 minutes until she was released. The police decided to accede to the demand, but a communication breakdown delayed Lublich's return to the bus, whereupon Degowski shot and killed 14-year-old Emanuele De Giorgi. Moments later, Lublich was returned. No paramedics were on site, and young De Giorgi died 2 hours later in the hospital. The bus hit the road again at 11:45 p.m., heading towards the Netherlands, where Rusner apparently believed the police would be more receptive. The passengers were ordered to stand at the windows as human shields. After the shooting, the police were now more aggressively pursuing, and 1 police officer was killed in an unrelated traffic accident. By 2:28 a.m. on the 18th, the bus had crossed into the Netherlands. However, most of the media circus were stopped at the border by armed police. Women and children were released at 5:15 a.m., something the Dutch police insisted on as a precondition for negotiations. Shortly afterwards, Rusner accidentally discharged a shot which hit Lublich in the thigh and the bus driver in the hand, prompting a brief volley of fire at the bus from the Dutch police. The authorities provided a BMW 735i as a getaway car, which was supposed to be stopped by remote control, yet officers forgot to bring the remote. The hijackers took 2 18-year-old hostages with them, Inez Voitel and Silke Bischoff, the latter being selected because Degowski apparently fancied her. More police incompetence followed. They spent 5 hours staking out the nearest hospital in Gronau, convinced that Rusner would take Lublich there for treatment of her gunshot wound. Instead, the BMW headed for Cologne, because Rusner wanted to visit the cathedral, stopping en route for one of their regular shopping trips. Amazingly, the shopping continued on arrival in Cologne, in full view of the police and media. By 10:30 a.m., the BMW had become hemmed in by media and shoppers in the pedestrian area of Breitstrasse. Cologne police regulations prevented a rescue in an area full of civilians, but plainclothes State Police Special Task Officers, or SEK, were present in Breitstrasse and planned to act. However, they could not legally bring their firearms into the pedestrian area. Remarkably, members of the media told Rusner about the presence of the plainclothes SEK, prompting him to exit the car and threaten civilians with his handgun. Kölner Express reporter Udo Röbel, for reasons best known to himself, then directed the dispersal of the crowd, before jumping in the car to give the criminals directions to the highway. He was dropped off once the car got there. As they travelled on the A3, police in pursuit now decided to act, with the fate of the hostages described as, quote, a risk to accept. At 1:41 p.m, a police car driven by Will Rupieper rammed the BMW, immobilising it and knocking out Dugowski, but not Rusner. While Lublick carred in the footwell, Rusner exchanged fire with the police. 62 shots were fired into the car. Voitel was hit in the back by a ricochet and survived, but Bischoff was struck through the heart and died. Rusner finally surrendered 5 minutes after the gun battle had begun. At trial in 1991, Rusner and Dugowski received life sentences, while Lublick received 9 years. Dugowski was released on parole in 2018, after serving 30 years. Rusner received an additional sentence of, quote, preventative detention, and as of 2022, was still in prison. In the aftermath, much comment was passed on the actions of certain members of the media throughout the standoff. Whilst some saw their interference as averting violence, most saw their actions as totally unethical, and the journalists involved in the worst excesses were, for the most part, severely criticised. The German Press Council acted to bar any future interviews with hostage-takers, and Michael Konken, head of Germany's largest journalism union, referred to it as, quote, the darkest hour of German journalism since the end of World War II.